At first glance, it barely seems worth noticing. A small patch of embroidered fabric, sometimes a simple metal pin, often no larger than a coin. You could easily overlook it. On an American military uniform, it usually sits quietly on the shoulder, the chest, or the collar. To someone unfamiliar with military life, it might appear decorative, just another piece of stitching on a heavy green jacket. But that small symbol has a name. It's called a uniform insignia, and for generations of American service members, that tiny emblem carried meaning far beyond its size. At first, most people never think about it. Visitors in museums often walk past display cases filled with uniforms from World War II or later conflicts. They admire the helmets, the boots, the jackets. Their eyes move quickly across the larger pieces of equipment. But the insignia, the smallest element on the uniform, is often the one that tells the most important story. A simple eagle, a pair of crossed rifles, a star, a stripe. Each one quietly answers a question without a single word spoken. Who is this person? Where do they belong? What responsibility do they carry? In military life, those answers matter immediately. A soldier can glance at a uniform and understand something about the person wearing it in seconds. Rank, role, experience, authority, all communicated through small pieces of cloth and metal. To civilians, the symbols can look mysterious, but to the people who wear them, they are unmistakable. The insignia is not loud. It does not draw attention. In fact, its power comes from how ordinary it appears. It sits silently on the uniform while everything else moves. The marching boots, the rumble of engines, the long days of training and waiting. But in moments of uncertainty, those small symbols become anchors. They remind everyone in the room who is responsible for decisions, who leads, who follows, who has earned the right to speak. In this way, the insignia functions almost like a quiet tool of order. Not a weapon, not equipment in the usual sense, but something that shapes behavior. A soldier doesn't need to raise their voice when their rank is already visible. A commander doesn't need to introduce themselves when their insignia already tells the story. The symbol speaks first. And in an environment where confusion can spread quickly, clarity is one of the most valuable resources a group can have. What makes this even more interesting is how small the object actually is. The patch might weigh only a few grams. The insignia might be smaller than a button. Yet the meaning attached to it can influence hundreds of people. It can determine who gives orders, who carries responsibility, and who must make difficult decisions when time is limited. For something so small, that is an extraordinary amount of weight. But here is the surprising part. The insignia was never meant to be impressive. It wasn't designed to intimidate or dominate. It was created for something far simpler: recognition. The ability for people to understand each other quickly in complex situations. Over time, that simple idea evolved into one of the most recognizable systems of symbols in the world. Today, American military insignia appear in photographs, museums, films, and history books. But when they were first stitched onto uniforms, they were just small markers, quiet indicators of identity in a large and uncertain world. And yet, those tiny symbols would go on to shape decisions, relationships, and moments of leadership in ways that most people never notice. Because sometimes the smallest details on a uniform carry the largest stories. The people who carried it rarely talked about it. Not because it was secret, but because it didn't feel important enough to mention. It sat quietly in places that weren't meant for history. A pocket sewn inside a field jacket, a small pouch on a belt, a compartment in a truck's dashboard. Sometimes even the bottom of a canvas bag already full of ordinary things. American soldiers carried it during long marches, during endless waiting, during the slow movement between one uncertain place and another. But they almost never touched it. That's the strange part. Many of the men who carried it would go through an entire deployment without ever using it once. Not once. And yet, they kept it with them every single day. Because the object itself wasn't the point. Its presence was. It represented something quiet but powerful. A final boundary. Not an aggressive one, not a dramatic one, Just the line. The kind of line a person carries when the world becomes unpredictable. For some, it was tucked beside family photographs. For others, it stayed hidden near a notebook or a pack of cigarettes. It didn't demand attention, but every soldier knew exactly where it was. And more importantly, they knew it was there if a moment ever arrived when hesitation disappeared and decisions became immediate. Curiously, that moment almost never came, which is exactly why the object mattered. Because in wartime, the most valuable tools are often the ones that quietly prevent situations from ever reaching the point where they must be used. And this small, forgettable object did something unexpected. It helped people stay calm in a world designed to break that calm. But the real reason it worked had very little to do with the object itself, and almost everything to do with the human mind. 110. In wartime, survival is rarely about strength. It's about control. Control of breathing, control of fear, control of the moment when the mind begins imagining things that aren't there. The small object in a soldier's pocket had an unusual role in that quiet battle. It wasn't there to solve problems. It was there to prevent panic. Because panic is contagious. One nervous movement can spread through a group faster than any command. A single moment of uncertainty can ripple outward until everyone feels it. And in those moments, people don't look for complicated solutions. They look for something simple, something certain. That small object became exactly that. Not a weapon in the traditional sense, more like a psychological anchor. Its presence created a silent boundary between fear and action. If things ever became truly uncontrollable, there was still one last option. And strangely, that knowledge made it easier to choose patience instead. Soldiers who carried it often described a similar feeling. Not confidence, something quieter than that. A sense that the situation still belonged to them, even when the world around them felt chaotic. The object bought time. Time to think, time to breathe, time to wait for a better decision. And waiting, in war, is often the hardest skill to master, because every instinct pushes in the opposite direction. Move faster, act first, do something. But this small object reminded its carrier of something different, that sometimes survival depends on the ability to not act too quickly, to let a moment settle, to allow the mind to catch up with the body. And that quiet discipline, more than the object itself, was what made it powerful. But eventually, history would place this ordinary tool into moments where its presence changed something much larger than a single person's state of mind. Moments when an unseen object quietly shaped decisions, long before anyone realized it had been there at all. 110. History rarely remembers the quiet objects. It remembers the large machines, the loud decisions, the moments that feel dramatic in photographs. But sometimes the smallest items sit quietly inside those moments. One example appeared during the final years of World War II, when American forces were moving through unfamiliar towns across Europe. The soldiers entering these places were not always greeted with clear answers. Sometimes the streets were empty. Sometimes civilians watched silently from windows. Sometimes nobody knew who still controlled the area. It was the kind of uncertainty that could turn ordinary encounters into dangerous misunderstandings. So American soldiers moved carefully, and many of them carried the same small object we've been talking about, not in their hands, just nearby. In one report written after the war, a young American soldier described entering a narrow street where a small group of local men stood watching from a doorway. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. The air felt suspended, as if everyone was waiting for the first mistake. The soldier later admitted something unusual in his account. He wasn't thinking about strategy. He wasn't thinking about orders. He was thinking about the quiet weight of the small object in his pocket. Knowing it was there changed his behavior. Instead of reacting quickly, he slowed down. Instead of raising his voice, he waited. A few seconds passed. Then one of the men in the doorway simply stepped aside. The tension dissolved as quietly as it had appeared. No confrontation, no dramatic moment, just a street that slowly returned to being a street. Years later, the soldier wrote something unexpected. He believed the object in his pocket had never needed to appear, but the knowledge that it could exist had kept his mind calm enough for the situation to resolve itself. And that is the strange part of history. Sometimes the most important tools are the ones no one ever sees, because their true influence happens entirely inside the human mind. War changes landscapes. It reshapes cities, borders, and nations. But the first place it truly changes is the human mind. Long before historians analyze strategies or weapons, soldiers experience something much more personal, a constant negotiation with fear. And fear does strange things to decision-making. Military psychologists began noticing this during World War II, and later again throughout the long years of the Vietnam War. In high-stress environments, the brain often narrows its focus. People react faster, but they also react more impulsively. That's where small tools sometimes played an unexpected role. Not because they changed the battlefield, but because they changed the psychology of the person carrying them. Several veterans later described a similar feeling. When they knew they had a reliable option within reach, their minds behaved differently. They felt less pressure to act immediately, less urgency to prove control, less temptation to escalate a situation too quickly. In other words, the object itself rarely solved the problem, but the confidence it created inside the mind often did. Psychologists call this a form of perceived control. When people believe they have options, their brain becomes more patient, more analytical, more capable of restraint. It's a subtle effect, almost invisible. Yet throughout modern military history, this psychological buffer has quietly influenced countless moments that never made it into official reports. Moments where someone paused instead of reacting. Moments where a decision was delayed by just a few seconds. And in tense environments, a few seconds can change everything. So the story of this small object is not really about metal, engineering, or design. It's about something far more human. Because in the chaos of war, the most powerful factor is rarely the tool itself. It's the mind of the person holding it. And sometimes the quiet presence of a simple object is enough to remind that mind to slow down. History rarely stays in the past. Objects that once belonged strictly to soldiers often find their way into civilian life. And when that happens, the conversation changes. In the modern United States, discussions about tools, self-defense, and responsibility have become more complex than ever. Some people see them as symbols of preparedness. Others see them as reminders of how thin the line can be between safety and danger. It's a debate shaped by culture, law, and personal experience. And like many debates in American history, there is no single answer that satisfies everyone. But one thing is certain. The story of small survival tools didn't end on the battlefield. In fact, their role may be evolving in ways the original designers never expected. Because in today's world, survival is no longer just about war zones. It's about something much closer to home. And that raises one final question. What happens when an object designed for extreme situations becomes part of everyday life? That question leads us to the final chapter of this story. By the time wars end, most of the objects that filled them quietly disappear. Uniforms are folded into storage boxes. Vehicles rust in distant fields. Tools that once felt essential slowly become museum pieces. And yet, some of the smallest objects leave behind the largest questions, because their purpose was never only physical, it was psychological. Across conflicts from World War II to the long uncertainty of the Vietnam War, soldiers carried small tools they hoped they would never truly need. Not because they expected disaster, but because uncertainty is easier to face when a person believes they still have choices. That belief matters more than most people realize. Humans behave differently when they feel completely helpless. Fear becomes louder. Decisions become faster, and patience disappears. But when even a small sense of control exists, the mind changes. People breathe slower. They think longer. They choose restraint. That quiet shift, almost invisible in the moment, has shaped countless decisions throughout history. Moments when someone waited instead of reacting. Moments when tension dissolved because nobody rushed the next step. And that may be the most surprising lesson of all. Survival is not always about strength. It is often about hesitation, about allowing a single second of thought to exist before action takes over. The small object in the story represented that second, a reminder that even in uncertain environments, calm thinking was still possible. Today, many of these objects sit behind glass in museums. They appear simple, almost forgettable, but their true influence never came from what they could do. It came from what they quietly encouraged people not to do. And sometimes the difference between chaos and survival is nothing more than that pause, a single quiet moment before the world moves again.